Welcome back to many of you, and welcome for the first time to others. It's nice to be with you this evening. My name is Corey Helfand. I'm the rabbi and spiritual leader at Peninsula Sinai Congregation in Foster City. And it's really a delight to be a partner with the Peninsula Multi-Faith Coalition and to be together again with all of you as we continue this very important and sacred work of really thinking about how we transform our communities and ourselves and the world in terms of how we respond to racism and in terms of how we build partnerships in an intentional way. The PMC, the Peninsula Multi-Faith Coalition, really strives to bring together our diverse faith communities as a way of building bridges in understanding and respect. And so we stand together with humility to acknowledge our common values, to learn from one another, and to serve our wider world. Before I introduce everyone, I just want to acknowledge for a moment Pastor Connie Winter-Yulberg, who is the president of the PMC, and appreciate her for all that she does, her leadership, her guidance over the recent years, and to be able to call her a friend and a colleague is a tremendous blessing. So thank you to you for all that you do. For those of you who are new to Zoom, or for those of you who have been doing Zoom for 8 months now and still have no idea what to do with it, here we are again, trying to make sense of it all. We're going to make sure that everyone is muted over the course of the next little bit, with the exception of our speakers, as a way of trying to make sure there isn't too much background noise. Hopefully, when you came in this evening, you were seeing everyone there. If you are not, in the upper right corner of your screen, you'll see something that says view. You can pick whether you want it to say speaker, which will highlight the main speakers for the evening, or choose gallery. And then it'll look a little bit like Hollywood Squares or something out of the Brady Bunch, whichever you prefer. In the bottom left corner, you'll see a microphone icon. You can make sure that that's clicked. There should be a red line going through it to tell you that you're muted. And also to the right of it is the camera button. If there's a red line going through it, it means that your camera is turned off. If you would like it to be turned on, please unclick. We just want to remind you also that we are recording this session. So if you'd prefer to be off camera, please make sure that it is turned off at this time. Also, on the bottom of your screen, there should be an icon where you can click to chat. If you want, you can share questions with us, and we will review them during the time that we're in the breakout sessions and be able to share them with our panel when we come back. Please remember that anything you write in the chat is for public view, and it's going to be saved for use later. As we enter into this space together, I want to remind us all of the power of listening, of really being able to be present in this moment, of sitting with all of the emotions and with the discomfort of what it is that we're feeling and experiencing. Discomfort is an okay thing. And being able to say that we're uncomfortable in moments when we need to stand up and show up is an important piece of being able to respond to racism. And I also want to encourage you to resist the temptation to immediately respond when you hear something, but to really let it sink in and think about where it's taking you and what it might mean, and hold on to those emotions and those thoughts so that we can bring them out to the forefront when we have our breakout sessions, or perhaps later when we come back together. I want to really thank all of the players who make sure that this can happen. There's a tremendous team. I'll thank more of them specifically at the end, but I just want to give a special shout out to Alexis and to Diane for really bringing us together in such an intentional way. I'm grateful to you for really helping us get to a place where we can deepen the work that we are all committed to doing tonight. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce our speakers. We're going to invite them to respond to 2 questions. They'll each have 5 minutes for those responses, or as much time as they need to be able to get through their answers. And then we'll be able to make the transition into the breakout sessions, where there'll be an opportunity to have our facilitators guide us more thoughtfully and more deeply into some questions about what it is that we're sitting with and how it is that we might turn what we're sitting with into action. And then we'll come back together, respond to some of the questions that are in the chat, and then we're all going to conclude the evening with a pledge that I will introduce a bit later. First, I want to introduce Reverend Christy Denham, a friend and a colleague, someone who served the Congregational Church of Belmont for 2 decades and is also a past president of the PMC of the Multi-Faith Coalition, someone who really helped to think about getting it off the ground, and so many other roles that she's played, anything from chaplain for the Belmont Police Department to being a moderator of the Golden Gate Association of the United Church of Christ. She is a single mom who raised 2 wonderful sons. We'll hear a piece of her story tonight. as well as a proud grandma to two, and has a passion for working with children and youth and a lifetime commitment to social justice, especially racial and economic justice. I also want to introduce April Vargas, who hails from Montera on the San Mateo County coast. And she has owned a small interior decorating business since graduating from college and has been a community activist really even earlier since high school. And a lot of her work has really been focused in a volunteer capacity. She's also worked as a legislative advocate for regional environmental organizations, has been a community organizer for statewide healthcare workers unions, and a campaign manager for the San Mateo County Democratic Party during the election cycles from 2012 to 2018. She's currently a member of the San Mateo County chapter of the NAACP, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the American Civil Liberties Union. And finally, our two students, Kelly Yu and Alex or Alexandra Iliapoulou. Kelly is a senior at Castellea. She is the director of outreach for Coalition Z. We'll hear more about that in just a bit. A Gen Z-led organization encouraging youth engagement in politics and social justice. She's particularly passionate about racial justice and the intersection between racial justice and climate justice. Kelly also works in other youth groups, including Youth on Course Youth Leadership Council, where she works to make golf more accessible and a more diverse sport. And Alex is also a high school junior. She helped to co-found and serves as the community coordinator for Coalition Z, where she has formed many intentional partnerships with other organizations. She's passionate about feminism, climate justice, and racial justice, and she's part of the San Mateo Youth Climate Ambassador Program, where she is looking further into climate justice in her own community, and eventually will hopefully implement some of the work that she's been doing and research that she's been doing in that area. Our goal tonight, because it's something that has been on our minds, is how do we transition from thinking about racism and learning about racism to actually doing something about it. It can't only be about understanding, though that is a significant piece of it. We must at some point be able to turn the thinking into doing. I was struck by two different pieces that come from my tradition, from the Jewish tradition. One is a text from the Mishnah, a rabbinic teaching, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor v'lo ata ben chorin lihibatel mimena. Everyone got that? Fantastic. Just kidding. Literally what it means is we're not required to finish the task, but neither are we free to neglect it. And I want to make sure that we recognize that our work here is not to solve all of the world's problems. And at the same time, we can't be people who just watch it all pass by. There's a moment after the Israelites receive the 10 Commandments from Moses and God on Mount Sinai, where they come down and Moses has the tablets in hand and they say, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will understand. A lot of the commentators wonder, why is it not reversed? Why is it not, we'll understand and then we'll do? And the most common interpretation is that sometimes doing leads to understanding. We started with listening and with understanding, and now it's time to act, and hopefully through our action, it'll bring us back to deeper understanding, deeper listening, and more intentional relationships with one another. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our panel to you. We're going to invite April to start, and then Kelly and Alex from Coalition Z, and then Reverend Christy. The two questions really that we're going to think about, the first one is, how did you come to living this work of standing up to racism? Feel free to share your stories and personal anecdotes, and focus also on what you're doing today. That'll be the first question. How did you come to living this role of standing up to racism? And then we'll transition to the second question. How would you guide someone who's looking to get started or continue doing this work, helping them to elevate their efforts in this most important time of need? So April, will invite you to unmute, and you can begin when you are ready.
Hey, well, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. It's very important that we're all together here to discuss these issues. And thank you, Rabbi, for actually giving me the first line of what I'm going to present. I'm going to talk about what I've been doing and how it has evolved into my understanding of the work that needs to be done. While I voted in every election since I became eligible, my involvement in local and national issues decreased quite a bit following my graduation from college and the formation of my small business. But in 1993, the county wanted to pave our undeveloped streets in Montera, and the plan they proposed was not a good one for our area. I wrote a letter of protest and was told that the comment period had closed. But weeks later, responding to protests of many other residents, the process was reopened, and I knew I had to take advantage of this unexpected opportunity to get involved. What followed was a few years of public meetings, private discussions, and almost daily interactions with a county department that was secretive, dishonest, and untrustworthy. Thankfully, our elected member of the Board of Supervisors at the time agreed with our proposals, and with the guidance of his chief of staff, he helped us pass the ordinances we needed to change the street standards in our neighborhoods. While this undertaking might not have seemed relatively important in the overall scheme of national policy, it taught me some important lessons that also apply to the fight for racial justice. First, if you never try, you can never succeed. We're always stronger when we work together. Those in power will never give it up willingly. And we need to elect representatives and work with leaders who have the courage and the vision to help us take back our power for the benefit of our communities and all of our people. Winning is a powerful motivator. 2 years later, with the help of the same supervisor, a small group of Coastside residents stood up against Caltrans, who planned to build a freeway over Montero Mountain to bypass Devil's Slide. This time we were challenging just not the county government, but Caltrans, a huge California state agency, and the Federal Department of Transportation. It took 18 years and a countywide election landslide, pun intended, in 1996, but in 2013, the Devil's Slide Tunnel opened, a project costing well over $200 million that never would have been built without people joining together to organize, mobilize, and fight for the power to determine the future of our community and secure a safe, reliable travel route for the millions of visitors who come to our coast every year. Subsequent victories on Measure F for the expansion of the Open Space District in 1998 and the approval of more environmentally responsible local residential design and building standards around 2004 convinced me that activism was worth the time and effort required to take back power and use it constructively and fairly. The same is true, I find, for the fight for racial equality and justice that continues to this day. In 1997, I became active in the largest political party in the county when an elected official suggested that if I ever wanted to see the tunnel built, I had to get involved with this party because the major decision makers on the local, state, and federal levels were all members. She didn't have to ask me twice because I had learned that developing cooperative relationships with those possessing power was critical to success. Membership in that party has provided the framework and the relationships, like my wonderful friendship with Alexis, that has guided my work on racial justice issues. I'll give you a brief summary. From 2012 to 2019, I provided volunteer and financial assistance to the Dominique Hoskins Black History Museum and Learning Center, founded by Belmont resident Carolyn Hoskins. But to this day, she has not found a permanent home for the precious and priceless Black history documents and artifacts that she's lovingly collected and curated for decades. Those with the power to help have chosen not to do so. In 2015, I assisted with the initial formation of the San Mateo County Latinx Democratic Club and its reorganization in 2020 to provide opportunities for the growing Latinx population in the county to amplify their voices and get more involved in public policy and government. In the 2016, 2018, and 2020 election cycles, I assisted with the campaigns of first-time candidates of color running for local office, and very happy to say that several of them won their elections. In 2016, I helped secure a grant for $85,000 to implement a voter registration program focused on the Latinx communities within our county. This year, I helped organize a smaller but similar outreach effort to Latinx communities on the coast side where I live. I seek to educate myself on issues of race in various ways. Over the past few years, I've read over 20 books by Black authors that document Black history, race in America, apartheid in South Africa, and anti-racism. I was a listener and advisor to a newly launching podcast called Democracy in Color, created by Steve Phillips, author of Brown is the New White. The podcast explores issues of race in US politics, and I'm a regular and avid listener. I interact regularly with Black opinion leaders and activists on Twitter and other social media, and I really appreciate the insights I gain from reading what they have to say on so many issues. One of the more difficult things that I've had to face in recent years happened in 2018 when I advocated on behalf of a Black candidate whose party endorsement had been revoked under questionable circumstances. Even getting a hearing to discuss this matter was extremely difficult, and when we did meet, it was an extremely disappointing display of racial bias and hostility that made me seriously question the true beliefs of people I had known and worked with for years. The candidate was treated with total disrespect and would not have been allowed to speak if I and a few others like Alexis had not intervened. Her supporters narrowly lost a vote that would have reinstated her endorsement. The incident prompted a difficult but necessary process of revising the endorsement guidelines and establishing codes of conduct for future group interactions. There's still more issues to be dealt with, and more positive action is required, and I intend to once again be involved. Finally, I recently wrote a resolution encouraging all 20 cities in San Mateo County to support the Obama Foundation's mayor's pledge to reform police use of force. The resolution was adopted by the party, and with Alexis's help, once again, it was sent to all 20 cities. We're happy to say that 7 have already signed on. Following the election, I will get more involved in policing issues and reform countywide. In closing, I want to stress that I believe as we confront racial injustice, it's extremely important for us to acknowledge our own racism in its many forms and remember that it's racist policies, not people, who are responsible for the oppression that still thrives in our country. We need to take back our power and help create anti-racist policies that will make justice real for everyone by working together, electing leaders that we can trust who share our values, and making a long-term commitment to change. Thank you.
April, beautifully said. I wanted to just reflect back 2 things that I heard that I think are worth lifting up in this particular moment. One is changing racist policies and being able to differentiate between racist policies as opposed to labeling all people as being racist. That's a very important distinction. And I think sometimes it gets us into trouble when we label people without really knowing them, and also recognizing that the policies are things that we can change. And the other is power. I think power is a really unbelievable thing that has the ability to cause people to withdraw, to have us live in fear, and also have the ability to make unbelievable change. And to be able to remind ourselves that power comes in different forms, information, relationships, being able to reach out, to stand up or be present with someone with what they're going on is an incredible insight to what it means to make change. I think we forget too often that part of what we are fighting against right now is the willingness to remember that the most powerful voice in our country are the people. They're actually more powerful than the leaders that we've elected because we have the ability to take them out of office, or we have the ability to change the policies that are enacted. We should all remember, based on what April has shared with us tonight, we have a lot more power than we think. And we have a lot more power when we do it in relationship with one another. Thank you for those beautiful insights. I'm going to turn it over to Alex and to Kelly to offer us insight into how they came to doing the work that they're doing right now.
Okay, I'll start. So I'd say the first big moment that my generation started getting involved in politics is the 2016 election. I remember, like, as a girl, like, hearing that those results, like, that was a little bit scary for me. But that also caused me to reflect on how I felt about feminism and how I felt as a girl, and how seeing how different genders were treated differently in society. And then in middle school, I started getting more involved with like the March for Our Lives movement, and I went to that protest, and that was kind of my first experience like marching in a protest. So that seeing that like so many people could agree on one thing was super empowering, and that kind of, I carried that with me throughout my journey of activism. After that, I really started getting into policy and reading bills and following politics in the news. And I would notice more and more injustices in our country for different groups and genders and religions and all of that. And that kind of, prompted me to start speaking up more. And then was the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. It had gained gained attention multiple times in the media, and I started looking more into it and seeing how unfair it all was, and just kind of reflecting on it and using my voice to, take a stance, especially when I didn't see my peers doing it. I felt like it was something I needed to do. And that kind of got me into social media advocacy, where I would reach out to different people using the platforms I did have. And eventually that led to me wanting to make a difference at my school. And I talked to one of my friends, and we actually created the Coalition Z San Mateo chapter with the goal of making a difference in our community, because we agreed that change had to start locally. And so we spent all of this year building it up, organizing initiatives surrounding racial justice, and just raising awareness for issues we felt super passionate about and we felt like we can make a difference in. And then this summer, we started getting a lot more attention after our stance on Black Lives Matter and our protests, which I'll touch more about later. But and that leads us to now, where we're doing a bunch of different initiatives. We've reached out to, our group is almost 30 teens, and
Yeah, so just to touch a little bit on how I got into activism, same with Alex. I think the 2016 elections was a big awakening moment for a lot of people in my generation, or in our generation. And also I feel like with activism, because I go to an all-girls school, that all-girls school experience sort of shaped my views around feminism. And so that's sort of where I started, because I've been lucky enough to sort of grow up in a high school environment where it's a lot of, where women aren't seen as inferior. And so I think that sort of started my activism journey, where we learned a lot about feminism. And then I started getting more into different clubs at my school. So example, Human Rights Watch Club at my school, and seeing the injustices that are going on around the world, and also reading them in the news, and realizing feeling as if I couldn't do anything because I was too young to, and kind of feeling helpless, and I really didn't like that feeling. And so I started finding other ways where I can sort of make a difference and make a tangible change. And one of the ways in which I've done that is I discovered Coalition Z through social media when they were looking for new members. And so I decided to apply, and ended up as director of outreach there. And so that's one way that I've been making a difference. And also I've been noticing that because I play golf, and so in golf, although I do really love golf, it's definitely not a very diverse sport racially and also class-wise. And so I joined a program called Youth on Course and their youth leadership board to help make golf a more accessible sport and also diverse sport. And so that's just a little bit about my background.
So that leads us more into what Coalition Z is, and how we kind of use our influence to kind of make a difference in our community. We started out just wanting to give a voice to our generation, because when you're under 18 and you can't vote on all these issues you're hearing about, it's super disheartening, and it kind of feels, yeah, like you don't have a voice and you can't really make a difference. So our goal was to make these teens and our peers more politically literate, so when they were eligible to vote, in addition to using social media advocacy and things that they can already do now, when they're eligible to vote, they know what they want to vote on, they know their stance on these political issues, they know the effects of what their vote will eventually lead to. And so through this we did group discussions to hear a bunch of different opinions, because everyone from our chapter all come from different backgrounds, all come from different cities and stuff like that. So we have group discussions to just hear different opinions and kind of understand different thought processes and where people are coming from. Then we also do lessons based on political science, so different ideologies, interest groups, things like that, political candidates, bills, and yeah. And through that, and through watching the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests this summer, we decided that we wanted to organize our own protests, mostly because we live, in the middle of San Jose and San Francisco, and our parents weren't willing to drive us all the way there because they were working, and also because those protests were getting so violent that we were scared to endanger our members. So we decided to organize our own protest, and we were able to coordinate with different speakers and community leaders, and Alexis was actually one of our speakers at our event. We were able to reach out to a bunch of different members. We got the mayor to speak, a former mayor, Claire Mack, she's amazing. Jackie Spear came, and so we were able to organize those community members. We also coordinated with the police just to ensure the safety of our protesters, and so that their voice could be heard and not overshadowed by violence. And we also, along with spreading awareness on social media, which is a huge part of our organization, we spoke with the San Mateo city finance director about defunding the police and looking into police budgets and kind of seeing how they work, so we understood what was necessary for them to handle and what was necessary for other professionals to handle. And so we've been looking into that, and those have been our initiatives since then. But I think the protest has really played a role in starting a conversation in our chapter and our community. Over, I want to say, 2,000 to 3,000 people came, and we got a lot of responses saying that it was one of the biggest things that they experienced and participated in San Mateo, and we were really happy to just be able to start that conversation in our local community, especially when race doesn't seem to be a topic of conversation in our local government.
Yeah, and sort of adding on to Alex, because of sort of now the attention that and like the social media engagement that we've gotten from this protest, we sort of were thinking, okay, so now how do we use this momentum and make a tangible difference? And so part of it was speaking with the mayor and finance director, like Alex said, but also we organized a racial injustice conference where we invited a bunch of different speakers as well. And Alexis Lewis was also one of our speakers. She was amazing. And it was basically a day-long conference where people could come by and stop by and learn about any topics they wanted. We also had like people like an San Jose State professor who talked about the intersection between racial injustice and the sports industry. And that was probably one of my favorite speeches. And also because elections are coming up soon, we have been working on a bunch of different resource materials for people. So we have created a voter guide for all 50 states with each state's like registration deadlines, their ballots, the ballots that are going to be on and then also some other resources that they might need. So we have that available, and we've also been doing, of course, social media advocacy, as Alex has said. And so those are just some of the initiatives that Coalition Z has been working on. And yeah, it's really inspiring to see a bunch of people our age to so passionate about certain issues and willing to sort of go out and make a tangible change. So yeah.
So Kelly and Alex, first I want to thank you for how articulate you spoke and for your thoughtfulness and of course for your leadership. It's really inspiring to see the next generation ready and excited and eager to go out and help partner with us who perhaps are a little bit behind the times. We should have gotten there a long time ago. And thank you for inspiring us to keep partnering with you in the work and for reminding us of the future that we're trying to create together, not just for ourselves, for our generation, but for the future generations. I want to come back to a couple of things that you highlighted because I think they're so important. Alex, one of the things that I heard you say was the power of just showing up, right? You didn't know perhaps that going to the March for Our Lives protest was going to be something that was so influential for you. And I think if we just get over some of the anxieties of just showing up, we can see what's possible. I love the idea of using the resources that are at our fingertips, social media, harnessing it for what we know we can do to help connect with other people. Sometimes we think that the ability to make change is so hard. How do we do it? And sometimes we have the tools right there in front of us. I love the idea about thinking globally, like how do we make big change and then using that to act locally. That was a phrase that was coined by a teacher of mine, Ruth Messenger from American Jewish World Service. And the ability of becoming more politically literate. We can just start by reading and by learning. And that is a great invitation into doing this work. And I love how, Alex, you spoke about the idea when you were talking about the police, you did it in a relational way. It wasn't just about protest. You said, I want to sit at the table with you and I want to talk and understand and I want to learn and I want to listen and let's do it relationally speaking. I think that's such a beautiful way, a point of entry for what it means to make this work happen together. Kelly, I loved how the way you highlighted your work with golfing started with a passion, right? You just started with you. We can find racial injustice and hate that happens in all of the things that we do on a regular basis. You don't have to go to some big event or some small event or something that's only on the big stage. You can see it in the things that are happening around you. And we can all open our eyes and our ears and our hearts a bit more attentively to the things that we can change that are within our circle. In this case, it happened to come from a place of golf or even from being at an all-girls school and recognizing what that looks like to feel empowered. And also something as simple as educating people around voting. I wish that it was an obvious thing, and I wish all of the states had policies that made it easy, but we know that that's not the case. But being able to help people feel informed is a powerful tool of just getting started. So thank you both for sharing that with us. We're gonna invite Reverend Christy to share a piece of her story now about how she came to this work and also about how we can also get started.
Oh, it's also inspiring to me. I'm humbled to be a part of this. But my involvement with racial justice began when I was 12 years old, watching the protests in the South and the police with fire hoses wiping out really young, decent human beings just trying to stand up for their rights. I grew up in a white middle-class neighborhood for as far as the eye could see. I literally did not meet a Black person until I was in college. And in junior high and high school, I found myself being a solo voice, protesting in my classrooms and standing up against what was simply invisible to the people around me. And I'll never forget it, in the 8th grade, civics class, they actually taught all the things about government in my civics class. And I was terribly articulate and a little annoying and had been expressing my passion for civil rights and racial justice. And a guy in the back of the room just rose up out of his seat and said, "Yeah, but would you marry one?" And I said, yes. And then 20 years later, I did. And I have two beautiful sons who I thought I protected from the realities of their father's childhood. And only gradually over time have I come to face, excuse me, what he was really going through. My husband, who is now my ex-husband, because he developed a addiction to drugs, was raised in a family with 5 other brothers and sisters. And he grew up in Marin City, which is a very intense ghetto area in Marin County, which is a very wealthy county, kind of a smaller version of East Palo Alto. And his younger brother ended up in juvenile hall and was killed by the guards. He was 16 years old and my husband at the time was 17. Imagine if your own child or your own brother was killed. He has a brother who spent 26 years in prison for a robbery. He committed it, but he only got out recently because of the COVID, wanting to reduce the number of people in prisons. He has another young brother who is doing life in prison because his ex-wife accused him of murder. She has since recanted, but there was never anyone there to stand up for him, so he's still in prison for life. He has a sister who died of colon cancer. She's my age and she's gone 5 years ago. He has a sister who lives in Richmond, right next to the refinery, because most poor people end up in the toxic waste neighborhoods, and that's where she's been living and doing her life. And my ex-husband did 4 years of hard time for the felony called assisting a sale, which means that he said over there, when an undercover cop asked him where he could buy drugs, because he was a guy who was on drugs and knew where you could buy drugs. And so there's a broken prison system, there's a broken justice system, and I have been living with the consequences of that all my adult life. But I worked really hard to protect my sons. I got them into private schools. They're really smart. I thought I was doing great. And when my youngest was 7 years old, he announced to me that all he wanted to do was run in front of a truck and die. And I took him to therapy. The therapist didn't understand that this had something to do with his self-hatred, being Black kid in a white community. But he now just suffers from clinical depression. He's worked through it enough to go to Columbia University on full scholarship and pull a life together in finance and is doing great. My other son dropped out of college because his father went on a bender and he was trying to figure out how to rescue his younger brother and sister from another relationship that his father had, and ended up going into construction, which he loves, which is great. He's a wonderful father, an amazing human being. They're both incredibly wise people. And because he's in construction, he works in a field that tends to be redneck. And he worked up at Tahoe while living in San Rafael for 3 years. And every Monday morning, he would load up his truck and drive to Tahoe. And on Monday mornings at 3 a.m., he was always terrified because he was loading up a truck in a white middle-class neighborhood, not knowing if somebody would call the police on him because this suspicious-looking Black man was loading up a truck that they didn't know whether he owned it or not, and whether he'd have a chance to talk to the police was always a question. So for 3 years, every Monday morning, he was terrified. My other son has been protesting actively in the Black Lives Matter protests in New York City in spite of the COVID epidemic, and I have been doing what I can to educate my friends. I've been very involved with the League of Women Voters because they have a criminal justice arm to it and are helping to educate the wider community on justice issues as well as on voting issues. They've been doing forever. And it's all been overwhelming to me recently, because the bottom line for someone who is Black in this society, and pretty much true for all people of color, is there's a level of trauma that life gives you that is invisible to most people. And as a mother, it was even invisible to me. And that trauma is very much like what it's like for someone coming back from war, where the violence you've experienced is something you can't explain to somebody who hasn't been there. Or like the violence of a survivor of rape or sexual assault, domestic abuse. Those are all places where we understand that kind of trauma and want to be really sensitive to people who've been through it. And right now, a lot of us have a temptation to want to reach out to our Black friends and say, help me, show me what I can do, tell me what I can do. And it's our job to not put this on them, because they're already up to here. Everything they see on television is reigniting the trauma they have lived with for 400 years. It is our job to educate ourselves. And yes, we have to go beyond education, but that's a beginning. Read the books, do the research, find out what's really going on in our society, but then do join a group. Reach out to people who you can experience as kindred spirits. I have found that the most important thing for me is to continue to check myself, because I have privilege. Where I walk through life, I'm going to get whatever I ask for pretty much. I'm the intelligent looking white girl and I can handle things, and I put my kids into private schools where I thought they'd be safe, but they actually weren't, because the world assumes things about Black folks that I wasn't fully aware those assumptions were being placed on them. So I'm constantly asking myself, where's my superiority complex in this? You know, I've always thought I was the smartest person in a room. Well, it's a real problem when I'm dealing with a room full of people who've had experience that I cannot understand. There's a certain colonial mentality. We've grown up in a culture that tells us this is our world and we're able to just do what we want to do. We don't experience being followed around in the stores when we go in to buy something. There's no sense that we're dangerous when we walk down the street. People don't cross the street when they see us coming. And then there is that sense of white innocence, that it's not about me. I didn't do anything. Well, yeah, but you live with the privilege. Every one of us lives with the privilege, and who is white, and it's not okay to just say, well, I feel a little guilty about what happened in the past. We have work we have to do now. And finally, one of the things that I struggled with initially in my work was my fear of Black women's anger. Because as a white woman, having married a Black man, I already was in trouble. But there was this fear that I would be treated badly, and that's my problem, it's not theirs. And I have to address my own issues and really become aware of where I am not living up to my own values. And my own values say that every single human being is sacred, and my work is about looking into the heart of every person and honoring that person as an individual and listening as well as I can. When I ask my oldest son, who I'm staying with right now, what should I tell a group that wants to do anti-racist work? And he said, tell them to listen. Tell them to listen to people of color, and don't ask them to guide you in what you need to do, but listen to what they're feeling. And then if you want to share your own experience, ask first if it's okay to share what you're going through, because honoring by listening is first, foremost, and perhaps the most important thing you do. Be quiet, breathe before you respond when you've heard something that's uncomfortable. Ask to share. Find support from people who are kindred spirits, and become more effective in the ways that you respond to the world around you. One of my challenges is that I'm very blunt and direct, and upset people really easily. And I've been having to learn how to when I'm confronting racism, when I experience it in a social gathering, to quietly say, that's not my experience, and then talk about what, at one point I just had to say, don't you tell my son that he ought to go into that place, because that's dangerous for him. But, you know, there's ways that we can respond to other people's misunderstandings that are more sensitive, that can actually allow them to hear us, and that's always a challenge. For me, if I'm driving down the road and I see a police officer having pulled over a person of color, I just go to where it's safe and close and park and videotape. I don't get involved, because getting involved, even, you know, confronting in any way, only puts that person of color's life in danger. But videotape is powerful, and it allows us to be a witness and perhaps save a life, because the police know they're being watched. I do not expect people of color to educate me. I am doing my best to continue to educate myself. I just finished a wonderful book on the life of James Baldwin, called Begin Again, a man who watched the cycles of our racial injustice year upon year and tried to witness to it. And he has great wisdom to share. I know that we have a whole bunch of recommended sources on the Peninsula Multi-Faith Coalition website under the Standing Against Racism page. Lots of books are recommended, and articles, and all the group Generation Z material is there. Our education committee in the PMC is going to start a book group on See No Stranger, which is the story of Valerie Kerr, a Sikh woman who's been doing justice work her whole adult life. Began really on 9/11 because the Sikh community started to be assaulted when ignorance of what caused those attacks was focused on anybody who looked different. And that book group's going to start on November 10th. And if you're interested, we can send you more information on that. But there's just always ways to find support and find ways to discover what your gift in doing the work. I especially loved Kelly's lifting up of golf as a way to do the work. Wherever you are in the world, you have opportunities to encounter injustice. It permeates our culture on every level. Maybe you can become a political activist. Maybe you can get involved in your community. Maybe you will find some small group that you can work with. But don't try to do it alone, because it's draining, it's demanding, it creates its own trauma. And I'm really honored to have been able to be here and share some small part of my story.
So Christy, before I reflect back some of the things that I heard you say, I just want to take a moment to express my gratitude to you for your vulnerability, for your authenticity, for being real, for talking about stuff that's really hard. Even you talked about the trauma of others, you also talked about your own trauma.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the work that we have to do. And I just want to appreciate for a moment that the hard work starts with ourselves, and what you just allowed us to witness was someone who's actually done that hard work. And you've done it in relationship with your boys and with your ex-husband and the family. And you've also reminded me, as also a white male cisgender person, of the work that I need to do and continue to struggle with, and how that work is deeply important in order to be able to think about what it means to create a world that is anti-racist. I want to acknowledge for a moment, you shared a lot about what's going on, the injustices in the prison system. If you have not read The New Jim Crow, you absolutely need to read Michelle Alexander's incredibly challenging and real work of what's going on behind bars that we cannot see. I also want to acknowledge that fear exists on so many levels, right? There was the fear you had as a mom, and also the fear of your boys, and the things that you tried to do to protect. While they came from the most authentic and genuine of places, they still didn't quite get to the depth
Yeah.
of the fear of what it's like for someone, a person of color, to live with that existential fear in an ongoing way. And it's something that we need to pay more attention to. And I also think that there's something about the power of being seen, of really being able to see other people and their pain and their trauma, not just to know the story and not just to read the history, but to sit without responding, to just bear witness, as you did with your family and with so many others, and as you have invited us in to do with you this evening. The listening, the sensitivity, the compassion, the empathy that we so desperately need. One of the things that you talked about, Valerie Kaur, and her beautiful work, part of the metaphor that she offers us is we're in a moment where we have to decide, are we going to be people of the tomb or people of the womb? Are we going to see this as a moment of shutting down in darkness or as an opportunity for rebirth and new beginning and light? And I think part of what the work is we have to do is we have to uncover all of the ugly and the trauma and the pain in order to bring light back into the world. So really, kol hakavod. Thank you, Christy, for sharing that with us. We're going to take a pause for the next little bit, and we're going to move you into breakout rooms to really continue the conversation, talking more about this work and what's next and what does it look like, and sitting more with our discomfort. And if you're not uncomfortable, you ought to be uncomfortable, because part of that is really at the core of what we're doing. And also, more than just creating safe spaces, creating brave spaces to really be able to sit with and hear and to listen and to think about how we do this work in partnership with each other. So we'll probably have about 25 minutes or so in breakout spaces to talk and get to know each other a bit more and to share. And then we'll come back together to bring the evening to a close. So I'll invite the Zoom gods to move us into that space, and we'll all come back in just a bit. Thank you to Christy and to April and to Alex and to Kelly for getting us started such a powerful way and beautiful way this evening. Make sure going back together, and we'll conclude the evening. First, I just want to express my gratitude to all of the facilitators for guiding the conversations tonight. Some, it was your first time, and for others, it perhaps was something you've done several times, but thank you for your commitment to helping to guide the conversation this evening. I also want to thank several people who have been really key at bringing us all together. Again, to thank Diane and Alexis for their vision and for helping us all come to this space to be able to continue these very important conversations, as well as members of the Peninsula Multi-Faith Coalition team, of course, Pastor Connie and Dana Eisenson, Karen Stiller, who has been our host this evening, as well as Joel Miller, Dick Hyman, and many others. And finally, I want to thank our panelists, Reverend Christy and April and Kelly and Alex. I can't see them all because they've moved to different spots on my screen, but I want to express my gratitude to them for sharing so beautifully tonight, powerfully and openly and honestly about how they have come to this work and also offered us several ways to get started. And perhaps some of it is about just starting, not worrying so much about where it takes you or what the outcome might be, but just taking some act of learning or listening or our own stuff in order to be able to figure out where it might take us next. And of course, showing up here is an important act as well. There is going to be, for sure, more things to come from the Multi-Faith Coalition. At the very least, you'll be getting a survey over the course of the next couple of days. Please respond, give us your feedback, let us know what you thought, and also some guidance for going forward. Of course, there's going to be the annual Martin Luther King, Dr. King Day of Service on January 18th. I'm sure it's going to look different since we can't gather in the same way we ordinarily do, but please be on the lookout for that. I want to thank my colleagues of multiple faiths who are here this evening, both to take time to be with us and also for the leadership that you show in so many different ways over the course of the day today as we take on this work together. And finally, we're going to close with a pledge. This is a pledge that was written by the Anti-Defamation League. It's a pledge to speak out against hate. And so we're going to do this in the most cacophonous way possible. I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to ask everyone who feels comfortable to do so to unmute yourselves, and we're going to say this together, because one of the things that we can at least do as a starting point is so I'm going to share my screen, and you can unmute yourselves when you are ready. Karen Stiller, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen, please? Beautiful. All right. I'll invite everyone to join with me in reciting this pledge as we commit to doing the important work of learning about the complex and uncomfortable history of our country, as well as committing ourselves to ridding the world of hatred in all forms. Please join with me.
Recognize that respect for individual dignity is non-negotiable responsibility of all people. Speak out against anyone who mocks,
anyone who intimidate, sexually hurt someone, sexual orientation,
make a difference.
one person can make a difference, and that no person
one person can make a difference, and no
From this day onward,
an innocent bystander
this day
begins
to interpret
rights
the rights of others. Stay safe.
Civil rights for anyone.
Stay healthy.
Good night.
Thank you all very much.
Stay healthy.
Stay safe and
Yeah, that was
healthy.
Bye,
beautiful.
everybody.
That was great.
Wonderful.
Bye.
Thanks to everyone who helped organize.
Bye, Judy Williams. Good night.